Hello, everybody, and welcome to Open Source in Business, a speaker series that focuses on the role of open source in industry with a very wide lens, everything from what's involved in getting a job all the way to how do you raise VC for your company. And today I'm joined by Mårten Mickos. I hope I'm pronouncing your first name right. I don't know how the angstrom changes the pronunciation of the A. Mårten Mickos, former CEO of MySQL AB and currently CEO of HackerOne. Who is going to talk to me about the open source database market, how it's evolved from the early days, and I'm really hoping that we can dig into why it is that it seems to be database companies that are experimenting with open source business models and licensing models in a way that that other sectors of the industry, like infrastructure, don't seem to have been experimenting as much. Thank you for joining me, Mårten.
I'm happy to be here, Dave. Looking forward to it.
So I guess, can I take you back to the early days of MySQL AB? I guess not so early, in the kind of 2000, 2003 timeframe. So after you joined the company as CEO and after the project relicensed to GPL and LGPL for the library in 2000, I think it was. I know that Monty and David Axmark were there for a long time before that. But when you came to the company, what was your primary business model at the time, and how did open source play into the success of the project? Particularly, I mean, there was that phase from 95 to 99, 2000, where really MySQL took over from MSQL as the default free database.
It did, yes. It was MSQL that was the forerunner, and then MySQL tried to outcompete them and succeeded in it, and lived off at the time licensing fees and consulting and such. There's even an email from the founders where they say, we can even share the source code with you if you promise never to show it to anybody else or something. but they shifted, and in the summer of 2000, before I joined, they shifted to the GPL license, and sales dropped to a fifth of what it had been before, but then it started growing faster. But it was a brave decision to do. And the main impetus for the decision was that back then, if you wanted to do something in open source, you had to be on the distros, the Linux distros. And to be accepted in Red Hat and SUSE, who are the leading distros at the time, you had to be licensed under an OSI approved license. And GPL was the most common and popular one back then. So they picked GPL to be able to be part of the distros, which then immediately happened. And at that point, also the business model transitioned it into what's called dual licensing, a model that was originally pioneered by GhostScript, which was another company that had come up with this idea, and MySQL took the same idea. And it's a very simple idea. It says, of course, everything should be open. And if you agree to sharing everything you produce completely openly, then you could use our product as well. And we all share and share alike. But if you, as the customer or user of our product, if you feel a reason to keep your software closed, then you have to pay us for the right to close our software too. But if you operate in the fully free and open source software world, then there are no licensing fees needed. You can do whatever you like. But the moment you close something, you have to obtain a dual license, a separate license from us to do the same with MySQL. So that was the business model from essentially 2000 up to 2005, 6, 7. It sort of then started changing, but it was the main business model.
Did you have, at the time, any contributors who weren't working for MySQL AB who were working on the database engine? And how did they take the move to dual licensing and relicensing their changes under a proprietary license, if you did?
Yeah, it was never a huge problem. So initially, most of the product was written by the founder and a few other people who were employed by the company. So there were never that many contributions, but there were contributions, and we always asked them to sign over copyright to us for the contributions they made. And in return, we would take responsibility for maintaining them. And it was commonly accepted. If somebody didn't want to do that, we said, fine, you don't have to contribute it. There were some cases where we paid for it. Like there was a brilliant developer who had developed a JDBC driver for MySQL, and we acquired the whole software and hired him. So in a way, he got a compensation for doing it. But the number of contributors was never very large, and it just sort of wasn't really an issue.
I do remember at the time, obviously the other big open source database is Postgres. And at the time, installing Postgres was a very similar installation and first-time user experience to what you had with Oracle or Informix or any of the DB2 or any of the other databases that were popular at the time. It was kind of cumbersome. There was typically a DBA that managed the database, as I recall. And MySQL was one of the first projects. I mean, you weren't ACID. You didn't have that, atomicity. I can't remember what the 4 letters are, but the ACID nature of databases. Yeah. It was a super easy first time install, and the database files were just sitting on the file system. You didn't have to configure a file system for it and whatnot. Yeah. Do you think that ease of use and first time adoption was really what led to MySQL really taking over as the default open source database in a lot of these web applications and things like that?
Well, I think in general, whatever you do in life or in business, to win, you have to be excellent in many different dimensions. And if you fail on even one of them, you may lose. So there isn't just one secret to success. There's 1,000 things you must get really right. But you are right. It was one of the early, the reasons why adoption took off so well was that it was so effortless for users. And we always said it needs to be, we had a 15-minute rule. Now 15 minutes sounds like a long time, but back then we said in 15 minutes, you should be able to download, install, and get going with MySQL. And that was unheard of because databases took days to install back then. And we made sure you could do it in 15 minutes. Today, of course, you spin up a container somewhere and you probably do it in tens of milliseconds. But back then, 15 minutes was completely revolutionary. But we did other things as well that nobody else was doing. And it's not just Postgres. All the other databases missed that train. They didn't see what the web would bring, a web database where you didn't charge per user, where the main reason for the database was to serve a website. For instance, we introduced the limit clause that allowed you to browse through a database to 20, 30, 40 items at a time, a thing which back then was seen as a violation of the SQL standard. And we said, we don't care if it is a violation of the SQL standard. People need it when they build websites.
I wasn't aware of that. I didn't realize that was seen as SQL not compliant. That's interesting.
Well, because some people said that a relational set is unordered. So there's no such thing as the first 20. And I said, well, yeah, but there is. And in practice there is. So we did it. But there were many other things. There was, even before I joined, so it wasn't my idea, but a brilliant action to every time somebody sent in a question about MySQL, whoever received the question would immediately update the manual, which was online always, and respond back and say, it's in the manual. And in that way, the reference manual grew with exactly the answers that people were looking for. And the reference manual became the driver of learning of MySQL. And the fact that we didn't license it, we didn't hide it, it was available online on the web. You could just Google for, when not initially, but when Google came out, you could, in a search engine, search for the error codes or something, and you'd find the answers. It was everything at your fingertips, which now is given and obvious to everybody. But back in 99, 2000, and then the early 2000, it wasn't at all a given. And Postgres was such a difficult database to install, use, learn, far too complex. It had the vacuum command you had to use. You had to vacuum the database. Like, why do you have to vacuum a database? But you had to do that every now and then. And it didn't support replication in the way that it should be done, so it couldn't scale out. Every other database was scaling up, we were scaling out, and we rode on that enormous growth of the Intel 386 architecture and then the LAMP stack and all of that. It was just all of those things played together that caused this enormous growth of user base for MySQL back then.
So you mentioned that when you moved to the GPL, that you initially lost some sales, but you grew in adoption. Do you feel like to what extent was the fact that you were open source kind of key to that adoption? And did you ever have any issue or concerns about trying to sell proprietary licenses to that open source community, open source adoption community? I mean, I know
it was the biggest thing back then. Like today, what we're discussing now has become irrelevant. It doesn't matter anymore. But back then, licensing mattered, business model mattered, and we were the pioneers. So we were the experts on open source business models in the whole world. And of course, we made a lot of mistakes as we developed it, but we also figured it out. And we figured out the business model that would work with everybody. And that's when we learned, and I coined this saying that there are some people who will spend any amount of time in order to save money, and others who will spend money in order to save time. And that's our community. The user community, we should never try to sell to, because they are just trying to save money, but the customers are trying to save time, and to them we can sell all the things that allow them to sell time, to save time. And then the fact that the database server itself was free and open source software in the middle, it stopped mattering, because we had things to sell to those looking for convenience, and we had wonderful source code to give to those who were just using it. And mind you, most people never looked at the source code of MySQL. It's not that you needed to look at the source code, it is that you knew you could. It's like, and we explained it by saying, in your car, how often do you open the hood and look at the engine? Not often. Like, many people never do it. But would you buy a car where you can't do it? No, you would never do that. Like, you have to know, you must know that if needed, you can go in, you can open the hood and do what you need to do with the engine. And it was, we learned these things in the early 2000s, and the world didn't know it then, because it was new. Open source was new. There was just Red Hat, bigger than us. Then it was MySQL. Then there was JBoss, and that was it. It was a smaller companies, but that was the universe of open source business.
I remember. I'm curious how, like you mentioned, experimenting quite a bit with business models. And I guess one of the things that you want to do is figure out who are the people who will spend money to save time. So how did you go about segmenting the market? I mean, we're going to get to the open core model and having features that paying customers were interested in paying for. But before you got to that, how did you go about figuring out? Like, was it all inbound? Was it just?
It was all inbound. We had huge inbound interest, but I would say that the dual licensing allowed us to sell to tech companies while we were building our presence in the market to start selling to regular enterprise customers.
Okay.
So we were dreaming of becoming a vendor to the enterprise for the longest time. And the year 2003, we said, this is the year of the enterprise. Well, MySQL still is penetrating the enterprise more and more, so it's still going on. But we had a great business model to sell to tech companies and get money from them and deal flow and revenues, while we were building the product and the subscription model and the add-ons that we could then sell to sort of regular enterprises who are not necessarily shipping a product, but they just need a database in-house. So it worked out quite well. But I see still today, even though the world is completely different from 20 years ago, many B2B tech companies have the same challenge. They start by selling to a group of progressive tech companies who love what they do. And from there, they have to migrate over to learn how to sell to the less progressive, the sort of the regular mainstream customers. And at HackerOne now, we are at that phase. We have grown enormously in the last 5 years. Every tech company is our customer practically. And now we are selling to financial services and government and car manufacturers and insurance companies. And we are going through a similar maturation or sort of expansion from the tech world to the broader corporate world. And we did that at MySQL back then. And most companies go through it. Like, you could look at any tech company and they go, like New Relic, AppDynamics, whichever, they go through that same transition.
It's been something of a theme in this series, is people talking about, the IT companies, the software product companies have, open source is now more or less won. But outside of IT,
more, not less, just more.
Well, I mean, there's an argument to be had there about whether user freedom is something that's winning in the case of, for
That I
example.
agree with, and that is a sad state of affairs, that open source software has won, but user freedom hasn't won as much as open source software. I agree that it's a long-term worry of mine that we somehow haven't defended the basic freedoms strongly enough, like the sovereignty of every actor on the internet, privacy, security, safety. We have a lot to do there. But fortunately, open source software which supports it is doing very well. So we have a role model, but we have
In
to.
the IT industry, but in other industries like healthcare, government, FSI, telco, they're just at the start of that journey. They're still, starting that journey, trying to figure out how to purchase solutions that are based on open source software in a way that it gives them the kind of the SLA that they're used to from their traditional suppliers. So even though I think we're seeing that same maturation, evolution for open source as a whole as well.
Yeah.
So were there ever any conversations around that time about adoption of the open source database being seen as lost sales or lost revenue? Was that a concern that was raised?
What do you mean? What do you
Inside
mean by
MySQL, that like that period of 2003, 2005, where the company had a drive to grow. That was a time when you'd already taken a couple of rounds of VC, I believe.
Yeah.
Was there ever any concern that the popularity of the software as the free users of the software were what you might call the freeloader effect, that this was people who were benefiting from the work without giving money back, that there was a concern that it was lost sales?
Oh, that way? Sure. Like some people will say so, like some sales reps are like, why are there all these people who pay nothing? But at the core of the company, we had made a commitment. We had picked the license we liked. And then you live with it. Like you choose your own license. If you don't like the open source model, don't choose such a license. But we did. Right. And we intentionally wanted everybody to use it, because that gave us powers that were far larger than Oracle's powers. Like I remember when there was a time when Oracle had 50,000 employees and we had 50,000 downloads every day. And I said, look at them. They have 50,000 people who drag their feet as they walk to work. They must be paid a salary, and they are not necessarily motivated and passionate about what they do. They just hang in there because they need a salary. We get 50,000 new people every day, full of passion, drive, voluntary power to do amazing things. And we get 50,000 of them every single day. So the power of our community was far larger than the power of the whole employee base of Oracle, which at the time was the sort of the Goliath that we were the David to.
It's interesting competing with a big company like Oracle. How did you position yourself in your marketing communications as the alternative to Oracle, the plucky upstart, the innovators, the disruptor, or did you try and say, if we focus on Oracle, then we're in a different market segment? Did you try and fly under the radar?
Well, no. So there's a little bit like we easily say that we competed against Oracle. We didn't. We were just positioning against them. And we knew that we were building a web database essentially, and Oracle's database is not a web database. So the use cases are completely different. But everybody loved to hate Oracle at the time, and they loved to love us. So we rode on that juxtaposition and played ourselves against Oracle every single moment, although we never competed with them for real. Like here and there a little bit, but there were other database companies that we outcompeted royally. But being the chosen David against the Goliath was exactly the right constellation for us, because it served us every single time. I would even argue that it was good for Oracle, because although we made them look silly, also when the press wrote about nothing but MySQL versus Oracle, the benefit was that IBM and Microsoft got no mention at all. So if people say, oh, there's Oracle or MySQL, I have to make a choice, many will still choose Oracle. And Oracle was happy. It would have been worse for them if somebody would have said you can choose Oracle or DB2 or SQL Server, which were the real alternatives. So this was, if I may say so myself, a masterful play of emotions and branding and positioning, and an act of boxing above your weight and going up and being loved by the audience because you have the guts to go up against something so big.
Mm.
But in reality, the use cases we solved to, like Wikipedia runs on MySQL, Facebook runs on MySQL, Google ran on MySQL. Oracle could never have powered them. Never. There's no way you could build such hugely scaling web properties on an Oracle database. It just doesn't lend itself to it. But MySQL did. So technically, our use cases were very different, but it was a wonderful marketing thing to always pick a fight with Oracle.
I do want to challenge you on something you said, which is you pick a license
Yes.
and you stick with it. But in 2004, you did change the license of the client and the libMySQL, the client library,
right.
from LGPL to GPL. Was that to create leverage for people who were creating applications that were connecting to a database to say, this is actually part of your solution, and you need to either open source your code if it's just connecting to a MySQL database?
We wanted to remove any legal ambiguity, and we always were, and MySQL continues to be, fully committed to free and open source software. So the database is available as GPL license. You can take it, use it, all those things. But we also felt that we very strongly felt or believed in this share and share alike principle, that if we are sharing with you, you also better share. And this was a way of making sure that nobody could argue about it. We think that it didn't change the practical matters much because our legal advice was that the outcome would have been the same anyhow, but it was a way of removing a point of contention or moving a point of ambiguity. And of course, we also said, if somebody doesn't like it, they can take the previous libMySQL and fork it and maintain it under LGPL or write a new one. Like, the world is open. You can write any software you like. You can write a storage engine for MySQL. You can write the JDBC driver. Write whatever you like.
And I believe that ended up happening, right? Is that libMySQL LGPL was
I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. It's one of the fundamental rights of free and open source software, is the right to fork. And it rarely produces any meaningful results other than reminding everybody that the right exists there.
But there was also some controversy at the time because there were BSD or Apache projects that were using MySQL, and all of a sudden they were linking to a GPL library, which was incompatible with the license of their project. So
if you operate in the open source world, of course you have controversy, because open source people are very opinionated and very principled. So, and the power of the open source world is that it allows people who vehemently disagree to produce something together. And there's no other model in the world that allows disagreeing factions to actually agree on how to merge code or create derivative work. So sure, but we solved them, and we didn't mind controversy. Controversy means publicity. We had controversy when we were sued by a US company, when we were a tiny startup from Scandinavia, and we got sued by a publicly listed US company. And we turned it around. We published every document about the lawsuit. We countersued for GPL infringement, which they had done, and we came out victorious out of that process, and it was the best marketing campaign we ever did. So like, when you build a business, you must be relevant, and you must also stand for some things where you can't always please everybody. And then the point is not to please everybody. The point is to deal with the detractors in a respectful enough way that everybody else can see it and respect you for that. Like, they don't care whether you agree or disagree with somebody, but they do care how you address the issue, whether you are open to discussing it or not. And like, we had a situation where SCO Unix, Santa Cruz Operations, which became sort of a dark force for open source, they wanted to license MySQL from us. And we were like, should we engage with them? And we thought, if they are ready to give us money, and that money is channeled into open source development, we should take the money. So we signed a deal with them. And that was an uproar and a controversy. And I spent probably 2 weeks on Slashdot responding to hundreds, if not thousands, of angry messages like, how could MySQL go and partner with somebody who is so evil? But once we explained how we had thought about it, that we are taking money away from that company, they're giving the money to us, we are putting the money into developing GPL code. Isn't that the best use of the money that SCO has? If they would spend it on lawsuits, it could be bad for us. But if they spend it on licensing us, then it's good. And we said, and there are well-intended customers who run on their platform who can't go away from it, and they need MySQL. So why wouldn't we provide it? So anyhow, it's a long gone story and doesn't matter anymore. But I've learned in business that there are times where you must just stubbornly follow your principles, and in the moment you get a lot of headwind, but you come out of it with your integrity intact, and people will, even if they don't agree with you, they can respect how you acted.
Yeah, there's a similar kind of dynamic going on around, I guess, selling to certain government entities right now. You know, there's a whole movement in open source about whether ethical open source licenses that say you can use this software if you do good things with it are open source compliant or should be. Yeah, it's an interesting area for.
There, I would go back to the founding principles of the Free Software Foundation and the GPL license. Like, there's controversy maybe around people there, but the thinking that comes out of that is so pure and so clear. And we have to stay true to it. If we start sort of becoming moral judges over everybody in the world, then the world will actually get worse. Like, at some point we must detach the topics from each other, say our role is to produce great software and put it at the use of everybody. And if you start judging and moralizing too much, you're creating a neurotic society, which is even worse.
I tend to agree with you. I wonder
are hard.
A generational point of view, because it's something that people who grew up in the 80s and the 70s seem to have predominantly, and I'm making broad generalizations, which all broad generalizations are wrong, including this one. But
or all generalizations are broad.
Yes, indeed. But there does seem to be a generational difference between people who lived through kind of the end of the Cold War versus people who grew up post 9/11, in terms of that view of the world in those black and white terms.
Yeah, maybe it could be, or it's just when you're young you're an idealist, and when you get older you're more of a pragmatist. I would say.
Perhaps.
But we have it at HackerOne at times where there are organizations who would like to be our customers. And then some people don't like those customers and say those are immoral or illegal organizations. We shouldn't help them. And that's another tricky question where we try always to be the doctor, not the judge. We try to operate on all patients, so to speak, meaning help them get healthy and help software get more secure, because if software is not secure, it's bad for everybody. So we try not to look at who or what the organization is, as long as they are legally incorporated in a country that we can respect. But we've had a case where we actually ended a program for a customer on our platform because we found their conduct to be so contradictory to the belief of ethical hacking and having a level playing field and listening to everybody's input. So we felt they weren't true, they weren't authentic in their use of our program, because they didn't follow the foundational principles that underlies ethical hacking. But those are difficult decisions, and it's important, I believe, to be principled in those, so that you don't, otherwise you fall prey of like the emotions of the moment, and emotions will change, and something which we find detestable today might be acceptable tomorrow, or the other way around. So those are tricky questions. But that's what I love about, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but that's what I love about open source software and ethical hacking and these collaborative commonses that exist in the world, that they force you to have a moral stance and an ethical stance, and they force you to think about fairness and respectful conduct and those things. Like, you can't hide from those questions. And I think it makes society better when we are confronted with them, because many people will run away from it and think that they don't have to solve them, or be silent when they see something wrong happening, and that's how really bad things happen.
And we've been increasingly open, I think, to having those conversations around things like gender diversity, racial diversity in open source communities. It's been an interesting time to live in. But I do want to get back to MySQL briefly.
Yes.
Another one of the business case innovations of MySQL after the acquisition of MaxDB was having a proprietary database engine. Proprietary, I think, disaster recovery tools were also something that was proprietary at one point. And kind of using some proprietary features as a lever to get more sales, say using an open core model. And you were, I think, really the first company to explore open core as a
I think so.
As a business strategy. Would you make the same decision again?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of opposition against open core, and just saying those two words makes some people just run away and hate you. And I would just recommend everybody to just think conceptually about what it is. We all know that open source is not a business model. It's a production model, and it also used to be a distribution model, but it's not so much a distribution model anymore. It's a production model. So you must have a business model that you build separately. And when you build those two, whether you call it open core or something else, you have something in your business that's open and something which is available only if you pay. And take AWS running RDS and Aurora, MySQL code running there at enormous scale, and they're making enormous money on it. But they have a lot of stuff there that is not available for everybody. Like you said, the various scripts and the deployment configurations and all kinds of tools and deployment options that they have on the cloud that somebody could say should be open, but they have chosen to keep them for themselves. Although there's a open source code, MySQL code, that we have written. So that is an open core model, isn't it? Or take any other company that, like, you look at Red Hat. How you define the core and what's proprietary and what's not, there are differences there, but philosophically, I think there are nuances. Like, if you take Android, what is Android? It is a GPL licensed operating system, isn't it? Because it's a fork of Linux. So it's open source. It's free and open source software. But the Android name is not free. So if you want to use Android as your operating system for your smartphones, you have to sign an agreement with Google. If you just take the code, you can do that, but you can't call it Android. So isn't that in a way an open core model?
Yeah, certainly trademark as a lever is another theme that we've explored.
So my point is that the lever can be different things, and we experimented with software tools and utilities, and I'm not saying all of our decisions were useful or smart, but we experimented and arrived at a model that would work. And now the world has developed a range of them. So you can say the commercial thing, or the proprietary, whatever you call it, can be the fact that it's deployed on a cloud, the fact that it's assured, the fact that it's up to date, the fact that it has a certain name or something like that. You could choose among all of those. And open core back then was the first place where these things were tried out and experimented. And of course, because it was open source, people were very opinionated. Some hated it, some loved it, some didn't care. But we knew at MySQL that we can't be loved by everybody. Or we said, if we are loved by everybody, it's just a sign that we are not popular enough.
Well, I would argue that there's a spectrum in the open core world. I would say, for example, that the example you gave of Android, if the operating system is entirely open source, then it's not open core. But the Android that you get on your phone includes hardware drivers that are not open source.
Right. Exactly.
So my question, where I come back to as kind of that dividing line is how useful as a standalone thing is the open source code. And it's indisputable that MySQL, when it had the proprietary backend, was useful. I mean, people were using it as an open source database for free. And we're very, very happy with what was it? InnoDB. No, InnoDB was the proprietary one.
There's a number of them.
I can't remember what was the name of the.
MyISM was the one that we packaged. MyISM was our own, non-transactional.
There were people who were running with MyISM and were very happy, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's that
not just very happy; they were also very successful and very rich. Like I met so many people who said, "Thank you, Martin. Thanks to you, I'm a millionaire." And I was like, okay, I'm not a millionaire, not yet.
Well,
but we had made the choice, and we lived by our commitment and our choice. So,
you know that line from Tim O'Reilly that you should create more value than you capture. I think that's something that the MySQL company definitely did.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it is true for any.
There's a spectrum where there are open source companies out there, or companies who have released projects that are open source, but are essentially useless. The open source is useless. It's like a teaser for the proprietary product. And that's not where MySQL came down. And then there's another extreme, would be where I would put Red Hat, where all of the software is open source, but the value is in the brand, the ecosystem of partners, the certification of the builds. But I'm interested whether you mentioned hosted services. That's kind of bringing us to where I wanted to bring you is in the more recent database-driven, in the more recent licensing, open source licensing-driven controversies, things like the server-side public license or the Commons clause, which was added to a number of open source licenses. It seems to be regularly database companies that are experimenting with these things, and primarily, I guess, because Amazon can run databases as a hosted service quite easily. What's your opinion on like how do you see the compete? You mentioned Aurora DB and Amazon's hosted MySQL services. Right. How were those seen by? How do you see those in terms of? Do you see them as something that grows the market for MySQL as a whole and as such benefits the project, or do you see them as unfair competition?
I don't see them as unfair competition because we chose our license and people are abiding by the license. So they're doing what they have a right to do. If MySQL were still operated as an independent company, if I were still the CEO there, we would be hosting it, and we had a plan to become a cloud vendor. So I just the only thing we should say is, why was AWS the only one who got it? Why didn't others do it? Anybody could have done it. Even Oracle could have done it. Oracle started owning MySQL, yet didn't provide it as a cloud service for a long time. So, but it is weird or sort of instructive when you look at the MySQL case, where I don't know the exact numbers anymore, and some I have never known, but broadly speaking, if you're Oracle and you own MySQL as you do, when you make $1 of sales on MySQL, at the same time, AWS does 10. And at the same time, the fork of MySQL does 10 cents. So there are many vendors out there who are building business practices on top of MySQL, and their revenue rates are orders of magnitude different. Not just slightly different, but orders of magnitude different. So that's something that didn't exist back when I was at MySQL. The world was not that exponentially driven. It was a little bit, but not as much as today.
Right.
And I think the fact that the world now is so large and there are so many use cases for databases, that the thing you asked about, the licensing of open source databases or open source components, it's not a universal life and death question anymore. But it used to be. When Red Hat's distro was the only really strong channel to get to people. Everybody had to be on Red Hat's distro, and everything became a licensing question, and you sort of it structured the world very rigidly. Today, everybody has their own little world, and the communities are so large that they don't necessarily overlap. So you can be MongoDB and have your license. You can be Neo4j and have your license. Every database can have their own license, and people don't care that much anymore.
You
Like
think?
there are these podcasts with open source enthusiasts like you and me, but we're not many.
Okay.
Maybe we're a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand people, but there's on the order of 100 million people out there using databases. They don't care about the licensing. They look for the utility, and they say, is MongoDB a good product? Can I get it here? Is it inexpensive enough? I'll take it. Or then I'll go to Google Cloud or Azure or AWS. And so we had this mania around licensing in the open source world, which was so defining back then and created such camps against each other. It's not like that anymore.
Well, I mean, this last 3 years with from the creation of the Commons Clause, which was used by, can I remember which project? I don't. Redis, or SSPL, which was created by MongoDB and has been adopted by Elastic and Greylog, and these are that licensing issue is coming back up, right? And part of it is in these
but as local islands, it's here and it's there. It's Redis has its own issue, MongoDB its issue. Really knowledgeable people like you will be aware of all of them, but most people aren't. Most people don't even know. If you ask them what license Redis comes under, most people won't know. And if you say, do you care? They'll say, no, not really.
Well, do you think it was a good business decision on the part of, I mean, it's hard to judge the quality of a business decision of a company not having all of the information that went into that decision. But do you think long term adopting a license which makes it harder for cloud companies to deploy your service will be a positive for Mongo, or do you think they will end up regretting that decision?
I think it will be largely irrelevant. That's my point. It's not a key decision anymore. You can go one way or the other, and what determines your success is something else. Like nowadays, how can you scale? How secure is it? How easy to use is it? People pay attention to different things. And if somebody pays attention to open source licensing, then I know, okay, that person has been around for 20 years.
Well, I would argue that one of the things that people pay attention to are, can I run this as a hosted service on Amazon? That's maybe, it's not a thing which is directly the license related.
But you could also count on the invisible hand of capitalism. If a big group wants to do it, it somehow will happen. The vendor will change their licensing, the vendor will create an exception, somebody will create a fork, or somebody will create a competing product. Like, it used to be very hard to build a database engine. It still is hard to build a really good one, but it's not impossible anymore to just build one. And there are so many. Go to DB Engines, the ranking, and you look at how many database engines there are.
Yeah, there was an explosion.
Maybe this world needs 10 different database engines, and there's 1,000 of them. So market economies are at work here, and they will overrule the dogma of this or that. And that's why
I think DocumentDB had re-implemented the Mongo API within weeks or months of Mongo relicensing to SSPL. So, if a fork is possible, or if a clean room re-implementation of the API, and the API is what's important, or API compatibility.
But it might be much more important today with how quickly can you patch the code if there's a vulnerability. That might be, just as an example, maybe more relevant today than what is the license. So that's why I'm saying that the problems we solved 10 to 20 years ago, they have been solved. They are not problems anymore. They are tactical questions. And like we discussed so much MongoDB and so brave to use a fair GPL and all of that. And now I realize that it sort of didn't leave a mark in history. it might not even have moved the needle. MongoDB is successful because they have excellent leadership, they have excellent go-to-market, they know what they're doing, they have a cloud-based offering, it's easy to use, it's practical, they have built all the tools, all the whatever needs, they have made it effortless to use it, and that overrides everything else.
So where do you think where do you think the database market is going now? Do you think, you mentioned there are so many open source databases, do you think we're going to see consolidation around a few that get like hyperscale?
No, why would we see consolidation? We just see some databases disappear because they are not needed. Like there's no need to buy them and consolidate them. But
Well, I mean,
but
that's
I do think
market consolidation rather than like adoption consolidation rather than consolidation.
Okay.
Buying companies. Yeah. But like,
well, I think that it's not a deep. It's not.
Everybody else will be kind of white noise.
Yeah. Well, we talk about the database market, but we haven't had one database market in a long time. There was one when I was at MySQL. Nearly every database was a relational database. The SQL standard ruled, and you stayed within a very confined space, and anything else died. Like they tried network databases, hierarchical databases, this and that. It just wouldn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly, not suddenly, but sort of it felt like suddenly, we got the NoSQL movement, and then we had streaming databases, Java databases, real-time databases, main memory databases, columnar databases, graph databases. And suddenly, from having just one paradigm of the relational model, we had a dozen paradigms, which changed it completely. And then we had the enormous expansion of the digital world, so that what was big numbers when I was at MySQL is nothing today. Like we had 15 million users. We're like, whoa, we are the leaders of the world. Nobody has 15 million users. And we were. But today, what's 15 million? It's nothing. Like it's one city in China. So like the world has really changed so much that there's unfortunately little that we learned back then that can be applied as such in this new world.
So let's talk a little bit about your current business, HackerOne.
Sure. Yeah.
So first, for people who aren't familiar with it, what does HackerOne do?
We crowdsource security. So we bring ethical hackers to hack your software before criminals can do that. We are the immune system of the internet. We are like a vaccine. Let us punch you on your nose, because otherwise a criminal will do that. It's better when we do it, because we will tell you what we find and you can fix it. So it's an incredibly powerful model where there are lots of, and I mean 1 million people out there who are ready to try to break into your system. And as a reward, you pay them a bounty. You pay them $1,000 or a few $1,000s. You fix it, and you are eternally thankful that you prevented or blocked something that could have been used for a data breach. And the bug hunter is thankful for having learned something, having had an exciting time of trying to break in and then getting paid for it and making good friends. So it's just an unbelievable model that will take over the world. And in a way, ethical hacking or hacker-powered security, whatever you call it, crowdsourced security, is to security what open source software is to the software business. The same idea: make a level playing field, open it up, invite everybody to contribute, and then produce outsized results, produce value 10 to 100 times more powerful than any scanner, any traditional pen test, any code testing technique, because an eager hacker on the outside can spot flaws that you could never find yourself and that you could never find with an automated machine or software. So
were
just an amazing model.
By the Sneakers movie?
Of course, this is the Sneakers movie.
Yeah,
it's absolutely the Sneakers movie.
So
but when we mentioned the Sneakers movie, which was a great movie, we should also mention the Hackers movie with Angelina Jolie. And what was the meaning of that? Angelina Jolie was the first time we had a female hacker as a heroine on the screen. That's when young women, girls, saw it and said, I can be a hacker too. Because the hacker practice had been very, very male dominated for no good reason. But with that movie, a lot of girls and women saw Angelina Jolie and said, that's me. I want to be like her. And now it's still very skewed towards men, but we have many, many more female hackers, and they are amazing at cybersecurity. Of course, why wouldn't they be? But it takes those role models. So sure, Sneakers is a great movie, but Hackers has the top mention for that one thing, that it helped bring diversity, helped make it a more level playing field. And today we sit here with 1 million hackers signed up on our platform, at HackerOne's platform. That's more ethical hackers than there are cyber criminals in the whole world. Like, take every cyber criminal, every petty criminal, every nation state group, every ATP group, whatever they are, it's not 1 million. They are maybe 100,000 in total, maybe 200,000, but not more. So we have a force for good that's many times stronger than the forces for bad that exist out there.
So the company is not a software company, or is there software at the heart of the company as well?
You use such ancient descriptors. It doesn't matter. Software is eating the world. Every company is a software company. We deliver value, and the value is essentially derived from 50 quadrillion neurons working out there, meaning the brains of the hackers and their curiosity. And we deliver it to you on a software platform because there's a lot of work that needs to be automated and recorded and analyzed. So there's a lot of software there. There's a little bit of special logic to make it happen. There's a little bit of hand-holding, meaning customer service. And so is it software? I don't know. I think the whole world is going software. So it is also becoming an irrelevant question.
So looking back on the time that you spent as CEO of MySQL and before and after your tenure, are there any decisions with the benefit of hindsight that you would change? Is there anything I'm looking back?
I have a counter question to you. Is there any CEO who will ever who has become successful who will ever say that something is a regret? Like, we have this, if we're CEOs, we sort of restructure the world to explain why everything was needed and everything happened in the best possible way. Like, of course, I made stupid decisions. Of course, there were things where I should have decided and I didn't decide anything, and it harmed the business. It slowed us down, and it was probably not the optimal path. But now, with such an amazing outcome that everybody is happy with, and the MySQL database that still today is the most popular in the whole world, then you say, no, it was all happened for a purpose. The mistakes were learning opportunities. The stupid decisions were just to show that we're all human beings and nobody is perfect. And if anybody wants to go and dig in all of that, then so be it, and let them do so. But
I definitely appreciate that. Every decision that's made by anybody in the world is the best decision that they can make at that time, right? With the information I had and the experience I had, the lived experience I had, I did the best I could at that time. But if you were advising somebody who were 20 years younger, just started as CEO of a company in a similar type of, what would you advise them not to try? What would you say? We tried that. We weren't happy with the results. Maybe you could avoid that one.
Yeah. Well, I think that the technical questions evolve and change over time, but the ones that are eternal is those dealing with human beings. Like, who do you bring onto the bus? Who do you keep on the bus? Who do you ask to step off the bus? And those decisions are the ones that you think about the most afterwards. And you wonder whether you should have made some change sooner, or whether you should have gone after a different type of people or group of people, and whether we should have involved something like that. So I can have such contemplations where I think, okay, what if we had done the following and in those decisions? So certainly there's areas like that. And then fortunately we were crazy enough to have big ambitions all the time. But I could also say that when I said we were going to build a cloud-based service of MySQL, it sort of is true, but it wasn't as strong in our minds as it should have been. Like, we were acquired by Sun in 2008. We should already have had a full commitment to cloud, because we could have seen AWS S3 from 2006 and Sun had a cloud offering, and we sort of said, yeah, we should do cloud. But maybe we were a little bit slow at realizing that that was the time to develop the offering so that we could have become the database service of the whole world. Now it became, for the foreseeable future, RDS on AWS, and that's fine. It's working beautifully. But I would say that back in 2006, 7, 8, 9, we could have built that service, and yeah. So maybe we were like, we had it in our thinking, but maybe it could have been a stronger determination at the time. Now it's easy to say afterwards. Of course, back then you were like, okay, there's cloud and there's mobile and there's all these things. Like, why would cloud become a big thing? It wasn't obvious back then that cloud would be a big thing, but we did see it, but we didn't necessarily see it for the huge impact it would have and keeps having. Like, we're not even seeing the end of it yet.
Well, lest we, give the impression that MySQL was not successful, you were acquired by Sun in 2008, 2009, 2008 for over $1 billion, for $1 billion.
Exactly $1 billion.
Exactly $1 billion.
Which at the time was a lot of money.
And continues to be successful as a project, both through Oracle and through all of the children that it has born in the meantime, like MariaDB and SkyDB.
I think you should look at the MySQL product today, and you will see that the best engineers are still working there. And the head of engineering is the same Thomas who joined us in 2003. And they've rebuilt the optimizer of the database, and they've introduced new scalability features at an astonishing rate. So people often think that when you get acquired by a big company, especially if it is Sun or Oracle, that you somehow get killed. That did not happen. It's an amazing story of how they've kept the culture, the passion for the database, built it out to be even much better than it was back then. That's why it keeps being so popular, because it keeps up with the evolution of the world. So I'm hugely proud of that team. I haven't had anything to do, like, I haven't been in charge for 10 years, no, 12 years, 13 years. It's 13 years now, no, 12. And but they've just kept galloping even faster. So I think it's a continuous wonderful success story. And of course, I'm very proud that I spent 8 years on it, but just seeing that you can keep a project going through all those turns and changes in ownership and stuff, and still you can download MySQL. It's an amazing database, faster than everything else, faster than Postgres, no question about it.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Martin.
Thanks,
I've loved this conversation. Next week, I'll be joined by, well, actually, Stephen Wally will be hosting, and he will be joined by Guy Martin and Salona Bonewald to talk about the interrelationship between standards bodies and open source. Guy works for, who does he work for? Oasis, and Salona Bonewald works for the IEEE. So they both have vast amounts of experience in open source and are now working in standards development organizations. So I think they're very well placed to have that conversation with us. Yeah. Thanks again, Martin, for joining today. And I hope to see you soon at an in-person event at some point, and if not, over the internet.
Me too. Thank you, Dave. I really enjoyed it.
Goodbye.
Cheers.